In 1579, a black man walked through the streets of Kyoto, and the Japanese people had never seen anything like him. They thought he was a god. Some tried to scrub his skin, believing it was painted. Children followed him in astonishment. Women gasped. Warriors stared. But he wasn't a deity, he was a warrior. And he would become the first foreign-born samurai in Japanese history. This is the story they erased from your textbooks. Picture feudal Japan in the 1500s. The country was tearing itself apart. Warlords battled endlessly for control during what historians call the Sengoku period, the age of warring states. Blood soaked the soil. Honor was everything. And in this world of rigid hierarchy and ancient tradition, the samurai stood at the peak of society. Warriors bound by Bushido, the way of the warrior. To become a samurai meant embodying discipline, loyalty, courage, and skill. It was almost impossible for a foreigner to earn this honor. Almost. But while Japan fought its civil wars, another war was raging across the world. European colonial powers were enslaving millions of Africans, shipping them across oceans like cargo, building empires on their backs. The narrative spread like poison, that black people were inferior, incapable of nobility, honor, or greatness, that they were fit only for servitude. For centuries, this lie was taught as truth, and any evidence that contradicted it had to be destroyed or buried. That's why you've never heard about Yasuke. Yasuke arrived in Japan in 1579 with Italian Jesuit missionaries. Historical records suggest he came from Mozambique, though some scholars believe he may have originated from Ethiopia or the Sudan region. He was tall, powerfully built, and possessed a presence that commanded attention. When the Italian priest Alessandro Valignano brought him to meet Oda Nobunaga, one of the most powerful warlords in Japan, something extraordinary happened. Nobunaga was fascinated. Here was a man unlike anyone he'd ever seen. And Nobunaga was a collector of the exceptional. He invited Yasuke to dine with him. He asked questions. He tested him. And what he discovered was a man of remarkable intelligence, strength, and warrior spirit. Now, understand what this meant. Japanese society didn't just have rules, it had iron laws. Your birth determined your destiny. Foreigners were viewed with suspicion, kept at arm's length, rarely trusted with anything of importance. The idea of elevating an outsider, let alone a black African, to the rank of samurai was unthinkable. It would have been like making a peasant a king. It simply wasn't done. But Nobunaga wasn't interested in what was done. He was interested in power, and he recognized it in Yasuke. Within months, Nobunaga did the impossible. He granted Yasuke samurai status. He gave him a katana, the sacred sword of the warrior class. He gave him land. He gave him a house. He gave him a stipend. And most importantly, he gave him a place at his side. Yasuke became a retainer, a trusted member of Nobunaga's inner circle. He learned Japanese. He trained in combat. He stood guard while Nobunaga slept. And when Nobunaga went to war, Yasuke went with him. Imagine the whispers. Imagine the shock rippling through the ranks of traditional samurai families who had spent generations earning their status, watching this African warrior stand beside their lord. Some were outraged, others were curious, but none could deny what their eyes showed them. Yasuke was real, he was capable, and he had earned Nobunaga's trust in a way few men ever did. For 3 years, Yasuke served. He fought in battles. He witnessed Nobunaga's ruthless brilliance as the warlord systematically conquered rivals and moved Japan toward unification. Historical records place Yasuke at several major military engagements. He wasn't a mascot. He wasn't decoration. He was a warrior, fighting and bleeding alongside men who had trained their entire lives for this. And, by all accounts, he excelled. But then came June 21st, 1582. Nobunaga was staying at Honnoji Temple in Kyoto with a small guard. It should have been safe, but one of Nobunaga's own generals, Akechi Mitsuhide, had decided to betray him. In the pre-dawn darkness, Akechi's forces surrounded the temple. 13,000 soldiers against a few dozen guards. Nobunaga knew immediately it was over. There would be no escape, no rescue, no miracle. Yasuke fought like a man possessed. He and the other retainers held the temple grounds as Nobunaga prepared for the end. In samurai tradition, when defeat was certain, a warrior committed seppuku, ritual suicide, to die with honor rather than face capture. Nobunaga performed the ritual. And then the temple burned. Yasuke could have run. He could have disappeared into the chaos. But he didn't. He made his way to Nijo Castle, where Nobunaga's heir was staying, and he kept fighting. He defended the young lord until the castle fell and he was finally captured. Here's where the story gets revealing. When Akechi Mitsuhide's men brought Yasuke before him, the general had a choice. Execute him as an enemy samurai or spare him. Akechi made his decision, and his words were recorded. Yasuke was an animal, and not Japanese, therefore not worthy of execution according to samurai custom. He ordered Yasuke returned to the Jesuits. On the surface, this sounds like mercy. But listen to what's really being said. Akechi couldn't bring himself to execute Yasuke as a samurai, because acknowledging him as a true samurai would mean acknowledging that a black man could embody everything the warrior code represented. So instead, he stripped away Yasuke's honor with racist language and sent him away. After that day, Yasuke vanished from the historical record. No one knows what happened to him. Some scholars believe he escaped Japan. Others think he lived out his days in obscurity. But here's what matters. For 400 years, his story was forgotten. It wasn't just forgotten, it was deliberately ignored. Japanese historians knew about him. The records existed. Letters mentioned him. Temple documents recorded him. But when Western scholars wrote their histories of Japan, Yasuke wasn't included. When books about samurai were published, he wasn't mentioned. When the story of Oda Nobunaga was told and retold, the black samurai at his side was erased. Why? Because his existence was inconvenient. The entire colonial project depended on a narrative of black inferiority. How could you justify slavery, brutality, and dehumanization if people knew that a black man had become a samurai in 1580, before the Mayflower landed, before slavery became industrialized in the Americas, before the lies about racial hierarchy became pseudoscience? You couldn't. So the story had to disappear. But Yasuke wasn't alone. Portuguese and Spanish records from the period mention other Africans in Japan. After Nobunaga's death, when Toyotomi Hideyoshi rose to complete Japan's unification, historical documents record that he employed several African men as guards and performers at his court. Their individual names were lost, but their presence was undeniable. They appear in period artwork. They're mentioned in letters. They were there, brought to Japan through the same Portuguese trade routes that trafficked enslaved Africans to the Americas. Yet in Japan, some found a different fate. Not freedom exactly, but visibility, service, even prestige. This wasn't a one-time anomaly. This was a pattern. And that pattern reveals something powerful. Africans were global. Even during the height of the slave trade, even during the worst atrocities, black people were reaching distant shores, adapting to foreign cultures, learning new languages, and in some cases, rising to positions that would have been unthinkable in European colonies. The narrative that Africans contributed nothing but forced labor to world history is a lie. And stories like Yasuke's prove it. Think about what had to happen for this story to nearly disappear forever. Archives had to be ignored. Primary sources had to be dismissed. evidence had to be waved away as unimportant. For centuries, Western historians had access to these records and chose not to share them. Why would they? It didn't fit the story they were telling. It didn't support the hierarchy they were maintaining. A black samurai was too dangerous to acknowledge because it shattered too many lies at once. It wasn't until Japanese historians, operating outside Western racial narratives, began sharing these stories in recent decades that the truth started spreading. Researchers found the letters. They examined the temple records. They studied the artwork. And they said what should have been said 400 years ago. Yasuke was real. He was a samurai. And his story matters. Here's the twist that should shake you. Yasuke's story was nearly lost forever, not because there was no evidence, but because for 4 centuries, historians didn't think a black samurai was worth mentioning. A man who walked beside one of Japan's greatest warlords. A man who fought in battles that shaped a nation. A man who earned the respect of one of the most rigid, hierarchical societies in human history. None of that was enough to make him worth remembering. Not because he didn't matter, but because remembering him would mean confronting uncomfortable truths about whose stories get told and whose get buried. If they could erase a black samurai who served Oda Nobunaga, what else did they erase? How many black queens ruled kingdoms whose names you'll never know? How many inventors created technologies that were stolen and credited to others? How many warriors, scholars, artists, and leaders were written out of history because their excellence contradicted a convenient lie? The erasure of Yasuke isn't an isolated incident. It's a method. It's a pattern that repeats across continents and centuries. But here's what they couldn't erase. The truth itself. The documents survived. The records endured. And now, centuries later, Yasuke's name is being spoken again. His story is being told. And with it comes a lesson that echoes across time. Your history is richer than they told you. Your ancestors were more than they taught you. From the courts of feudal Japan to the kingdoms of Africa, to the resistance movements across the Americas, black people have always been more than the narrow roles history tried to force them into. They were warriors and scholars. They were samurai and inventors. They were queens and explorers. And their stories survived because the truth, no matter how long buried, always rises. Yasuke stood in Kyoto in 1579, and people thought he was a god. They were wrong. He was something more remarkable. He was human. Fully, completely, undeniably human. With all the courage, honor, and dignity that humanity can achieve. They tried to erase him. But we're saying his name now. Yasuke, the Black Samurai. Remember him. And remember that if his story could survive 400 years of silence, then there are others waiting to be discovered. The question isn't whether those stories exist. The question is, are you ready to hear them?